Most medieval knights never rescued a single princess. They couldn't read. Many died broke, forgotten, doing something that would get them arrested today. But here's what's strange. There's one truth about knights so counterintuitive that when I first discovered it, I thought the source was lying. Why would anyone actually want this job? Everything you think you know about knights? Probably wrong. That shining silver armor covering them head to toe? Complete fantasy. Well, mostly. Full-plate armor didn't even exist until the 1400s. We're talking centuries after knights first showed up on battlefields. For most of the classic knight era, these guys wore chainmail. Thousands of tiny metal rings linked together. Sounds impressive until you realize a sword could still punch right through it. So could arrows. The stuff weighed about 25 to 30 pounds and hung mostly from your shoulders. Your neck would be screaming by lunch, and here's what Hollywood never shows you. Real armor looked terrible. We're talking rusty, dented, scratched up. Knights smeared it with oil or animal fat to stop corrosion. Picture a guy covered in bacon grease riding towards you. Less majestic, right? But the biggest lie? That everyone had this stuff. A quality suit of plate armor cost roughly the same as a small farm. Not a down payment. The whole farm. Most knights couldn't dream of affording that, so they wore whatever they could get their hands on. Mismatched pieces. Scavenged gear stripped off dead enemies. One guy's arm protection, another guy's helmet. Medieval mix and match, except the stakes were your actual life. Then there's the heat problem nobody mentions. Summer campaigns were brutal. Knights cooked alive inside their armor before they ever saw combat. Heat exhaustion killed plenty of them. The enemy didn't need to lift a finger. Now, you've probably heard the one about cranes lifting knights onto horses because armor was too heavy to move in. I believed this for years. Turns out, Victorian-era joke. Actual combat armor allowed running, climbing, even somersaults. There's historical footage of people testing this. Guys doing cartwheels in full plate. The armor was heavy, sure, but it was designed by people who wanted to, survive. So if the armor wasn't what we thought, what about the knights themselves? Turns out their backgrounds were even more surprising than their equipment. Here's the thing that would make medieval nobles choke on their wine. The word knight originally just meant servant or boy. That's it. No nobility, no fancy bloodlines, just some guy who could swing a sword and show up when called. For centuries, many knights were basically hired muscle. Peasant families who scraped together enough money for a horse and some weapons. Congratulations, your son's a knight now. The aristocracy hated this, by the way, absolutely despised it. But it got worse for them. By the 1200s, wealthy merchants started buying their way into knighthood. Freed serfs, too. Picture a medieval country club suddenly letting in the guy who sold them their furniture. Same energy. The old noble families threw fits about it. Didn't matter. Money talked louder than bloodlines. And here's where it gets really funny. England actually passed laws trying to force rich non-nobles to become knights. Not as an honor, as a tax scheme. If you owned enough land, the king demanded you accept knighthood so he could charge you fees for the privilege. Some people actively ran from the honor. Makes sense, right? Because maintaining a knight's lifestyle was ruinously expensive. You needed roughly 150 to 300 acres of productive farmland just to keep yourself in horses, armor, and weapons. That's not a hobby. That's a full business operation. Some noble families looked at those numbers and said, absolutely not. They avoided knighthood entirely because the military service requirements and equipment costs would bankrupt them within a generation. Better to stay a comfortable nobody than a broke knight. I always find this fascinating. We picture knights as the ultimate status symbol. In reality, plenty of families saw the title as a financial trap with a fancy name attached. So if knights weren't all noble warriors, what did becoming one actually look like? The training process might be the most brutal part of this whole story. Because those squires you've heard about, they weren't romantic apprentices learning honor and swordplay. They were basically unpaid interns for a decade. Here's the thing nobody tells you about becoming a knight. You didn't just show up at 18, swing a sword around, and get the job. Nope. You started at 7 years old. 7. That's second grade. And your parents shipped you off to live with strangers in some lord's castle, often hundreds of miles from home. You might not see your family again for years, sometimes ever. Your job? Serving food? Pouring wine? learning which fork goes where. Basically, you were a glorified waiter who also had to learn French, Latin, and how to not embarrass yourself around nobles. This was the page phase. It lasted about 7 years. Then at 14, you leveled up to squire. Sounds cooler, right? Well, here's what squires actually did. They carried their knight's equipment, they cleaned his weapons, they polished his armor, and yes, they emptied his chamber pot every single morning. Glamorous stuff. But wait, it gets better. Squires also had to dress their knights for battle. This meant memorizing exactly how to strap on 20-plus separate armor pieces in the correct order. Miss one step? Your knight might die because his shoulder plate falls off mid-combat. No pressure. Training wasn't gentle either. Ever heard of the quintain? It's a rotating wooden target mounted on a pole. You charge at it on horseback, hit it with your lance, and if you're too slow moving past, the weighted arm swings around and knocks you straight off your horse. I've seen videos of people trying these at Renaissance fairs. Grown men, face first into dirt. Hilarious for us, brutal for a 14-year-old doing it daily. And here's the kicker that really gets me. Many squires never became knights at all. Some aged out, some weren't good enough. But mostly, their families simply ran out of money before the dubbing ceremony, because that ceremony cost a fortune. New clothes, new weapons, a massive feast, gifts for the church, 10 years of unpaid labor, and you might walk away with nothing. Speaking of money, the dubbing ceremony itself was basically medieval bankruptcy in fancy packaging. Here's the truth nobody wants to admit. Most knights were basically medieval landlords with swords they rarely used. The average knight owed his lord roughly 40 days of military service per year. That's it, 40 days. The other 325, paperwork, rent collection, arguing with peasants about fence lines. I know, not exactly the adventure story you were promised. Knights functioned as middle managers in the feudal system. They sat through endless court hearings about the most mind-numbing disputes you can imagine. Stolen pigs, damaged crops, who owns that tree growing on the property line? Really riveting stuff. And the weird part is, many knights actively avoided combat. They'd hire substitutes to fulfill their military obligations. Basically, medieval temp workers who showed up to fight while the actual knight stayed home counting sacks of grain. Your dentist has probably seen more action. But here's where the real power came from. A knight who controlled a mill made money every single day. Peasants couldn't grind their own grain. Illegal. They had to use the lord's mill and pay a fee. Same deal with bakeries and wine presses. These monopolies generated steady income that battlefield loot could never match. Some knights got creative. They'd build a bridge over a stream on their land, then charge everyone who crossed. Toll booth operators with family crests. Very noble. Makes sense, right? Why risk dying in some foreign field when you could squeeze coins out of the same peasants year after year? The knight who lived longest wasn't the bravest fighter. He was the one who understood basic economics. Land produces rent. Rent produces money. Money produces more land. Repeat until wealthy. Let's not forget the political angle. Knights who stayed home built relationships. They married well. They made deals. They survived regime changes that killed their more adventurous brothers. Meanwhile, the chivalric code promised honor through combat, glory through sacrifice, noble death on the battlefield. So if knights spent most of their time as glorified property managers, what exactly was this chivalry thing everyone keeps mentioning? Chivalry. That noble code of honor where knights protected the weak, respected women, and fought with dignity. Yeah, about that. The chivalric code was written by monks and poets, people who had never swung a sword in their lives. They sat in comfortable monasteries dreaming up rules for how warriors should behave. Real knights? They treated these guidelines like most of us treat terms and conditions. Scrolled right past. Here's what chivalry actually meant in practice. If you captured a noble enemy, you didn't kill him. Not because killing was wrong, because a living noble could be ransomed back to his family for enormous sums. Mercy had a price tag. A French count might be worth 10 years of farm income. So suddenly everyone got very merciful around wealthy prisoners. But peasants, common soldiers, townspeople who happened to be in the wrong place, they received zero protection under this so-called code. Knights slaughtered them routinely, burned their villages, stole their livestock, and nobody wrote angry poems about it because peasants couldn't pay ransoms. They had no value in the chivalry economy. And the same knights who composed flowery love poems about noble ladies? During peacetime, these gentlemen held travelers for ransom on roads they controlled. Basically medieval highway robbery, but with better vocabulary. The tournament circuit showed chivalry's true face. The 1240 noose tournament killed over 60 knights in a single day. 60. That's not sport. That's a massacre with entrance fees. So why did anyone bother pretending? Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of medieval Europe's most powerful women, actively promoted courtly love and chivalric behavior. Her motivation? She was bored to tears by violent, crude men who had nothing interesting to say at dinner. She basically invented a PR campaign to make warriors slightly more tolerable at social functions. Chivalry was marketing, a reputation system for violent men who needed to seem respectable. The gap between the ideal and reality was enormous. But tournaments themselves, those deserve a closer look, because what passed for entertainment would make modern cage fighting look like a chess tournament. Forget everything you know about medieval tournaments from movies. Those elegant jousting matches with ladies waving handkerchiefs? That came later, much later. Early tournaments were basically organized chaos. Two teams of knights would face off across miles of actual countryside. Towns, farms, forests, all fair game. The goal was simple: capture as many opponents as possible and hold them for ransom. Think of it like a very expensive, very violent game of capture the flag. Except the flag could fight back and might kill you. And here's the thing nobody mentions. Knights used these events to settle personal scores. Got a grudge against someone who insulted your family? Perfect. Tournament accidents happened all the time. A lance slipped, a sword swung too hard. Oops. Nobody investigated these deaths. Nobody cared. The Catholic Church absolutely hated tournaments. They banned them repeatedly, threatened participants with excommunication, refused Christian burials for anyone who died competing. Knights showed up anyway, every single time. William Marshall is considered the greatest knight in English history. You know how he built his fortune? Not through noble warfare. He captured over 500 knights in tournaments throughout his career. 500. The man was essentially running a medieval kidnapping operation disguised as sport. But the fighters weren't the only ones in danger. Spectators died regularly. Crowds got trampled when the fighting spilled into their areas. Sometimes knights specifically targeted rich merchants watching from the sidelines. Easy ransom money. Right there. I've been to some rough sporting events in my time. Nothing compared to this. By the 1300s, organizers finally introduced blunted weapons. Sounds like a safety improvement, right? Wrong. They didn't care about safety. They cared about economics. Too many valuable knights were dying, and dead knights can't pay ransoms or fight in actual wars. The tournaments became more regulated, more civilized, more like what we see in movies. Speaking of valuable things, knights couldn't afford to lose. Their horses cost more than most people's entire lives were worth. And that's not an exaggeration. All right, let's talk money. Real money. A quality warhorse cost between 10 and 20 times more than a regular horse. That's not a typo. We're talking the medieval equivalent of parking a Ferrari in your stable. And here's the kicker. You couldn't just buy one horse and call it done. Knights typically needed 3 to 5 horses minimum. One for actual combat, one for traveling between battles, one for carrying all your gear, and backups for when they inevitably died. Because horses died constantly. Disease, exhaustion, battle wounds, an arrow to the leg. Gone. Now, those famous destriers everyone pictures, the legendary warhorses, they look nothing like the sleek stallions in movies. These animals were closer to modern draft horses, massive, thick, built like tanks with hooves. Speed wasn't the priority, power was. You needed a horse that could carry a 200-pound man wearing 60 pounds of armor while also wearing its own armor, then charge into a wall of spears without flinching. And the weird part is, these horses ate better than most humans in the kingdom. I'm serious. Knights hired specialized veterinarians just for their horses, custom diets, special grain mixtures, medical care that peasants could only dream about. A farmer's broken leg, walk it off. The horse has a cough? Call the expert immediately. Makes sense when you think about it, though. Lose your horse in battle, and you're basically dead. A knight on foot became a slow-moving target in heavy armor. You couldn't run. You couldn't maneuver. You just waddled around while everyone with a pointy stick took shots at you. so knights trained their horses to fight back. These weren't gentle creatures. They learned to bite enemy soldiers, kick them down, trample anyone in range. The horse itself was a weapon, one that cost more than most people's entire lives were worth. But equipment and horses meant nothing if you couldn't survive long enough to use them. And survival? That had less to do with sword skills than you'd think. The real enemy wasn't standing across the battlefield. Here's the dirty little secret about the Crusades that your history teacher probably skipped. Firstborn sons inherited everything: the castle, the land, the title, the wealth, and younger brothers, they got a handshake and good wishes, maybe a sword if dad was feeling generous. So when Pope Urban II stood up in 1095 and basically said, "Go take the Holy Land, and whatever you conquer is yours to keep," younger sons across Europe heard something very specific. They heard opportunity. These weren't holy warriors burning with religious fire. Well, some were, but most were broke nobles with expensive tastes and zero inheritance. The Crusades offered them land, wealth, and a fresh start thousands of miles from their creditors. And boy, did they have creditors. Many Crusader knights owed absolutely crushing debts back home. Taking the cross wasn't just spiritually convenient, it legally froze your debts while you were gone. Some historians estimate that debt avoidance motivated as many knights as genuine faith did. Bankruptcy escape with a holy paint job. But here's where it gets really cynical. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 never even reached the Holy Land. Not even close. Instead, these Christian knights attacked Constantinople, a Christian city, the richest Christian city in the world. They looted it so thoroughly that the Byzantine Empire never fully recovered. Why? Because Venetian merchants convinced them there was more money in it. Spiritual mission, meet cold hard economics. The knights who actually made it to the Holy Land and established Crusader states, they got rich through sugar plantations and trade routes. Not exactly the heroic image, is it? Now, I'm not saying faith played zero role. Plenty of Crusaders genuinely believed they were doing God's work, but the church promising that your sins would be forgiven and you could keep conquered territory? That's brilliant marketing. Here's what's actually fascinating, though. Those returning Crusaders brought back Arabic knowledge of medicine, mathematics, and engineering that transformed European society. Which raises an interesting question. If these knights were so tough, so well-trained, so heavily armored, how did most of them actually die? Here's the thing nobody tells you about medieval warfare. The enemy wasn't always the guy swinging a sword at your face. It was the water. Battlefield wounds that look minor to us, a cut on the arm, a puncture through the leg, even a simple broken bone. These became death sentences, not immediately. That would be too merciful. No, infection crept in slowly over days or weeks, turning warriors into fever-shaking wrecks who died screaming in camp tents. And the medical care made everything worse. Doctors would cauterize wounds with boiling oil. Some packed injuries with actual dung because someone once heard it helped. Spoiler, it didn't. If the wound didn't kill you, the treatment absolutely would. But wounds weren't even the main killer. Dysentery was. Every major medieval army got hit with it, and it spread through camps like gossip through a small town. Thousands of men and horses crammed together, doing their business wherever, contaminating the same water everyone drank from. The math was brutal. More soldiers died squatting behind bushes than facing enemy lances. Henry V learned this the hard way. At Harfleur, before Agincourt even happened, disease ripped through his army. He lost more men to sickness during that siege than he did in the famous battle itself. The victory everyone remembers came after the invisible enemy had already taken its cut. Camp conditions were genuinely horrific. I've been to music festivals with better sanitation, and that's saying something. Imagine thousands of horses alone, each producing around 50 pounds of waste daily. Now add the men, now add summer heat, now add flies carrying every disease known to medieval medicine. A knight who managed 20 years of campaigning wasn't just skilled, he was a statistical miracle. Other knights would look at someone like that and assume either God's protection or the devil's luck, probably both. Surviving battle was honestly the easy part. Surviving everything else? That took something closer to a miracle. Speaking of survival against impossible odds, let's talk about what actually killed knighthood. And here's a hint. It wasn't guns. Here's the thing everyone gets wrong. Guns didn't make knights obsolete. Not really. Early firearms were terrible, inaccurate, slow to reload, and plate armor? It actually stopped musket balls pretty well. Armorers even proofed their work by shooting it and stamping the dent mark as a quality guarantee. Knights could survive getting shot, so what killed them? Math. Cold, brutal economics. Training a knight took about 15 years. You started as a 7-year-old page, graduated to squire, then maybe became a knight in your early 20s. That's 15 years of feeding, housing, and equipping someone who might die in their first battle. Now compare that to a peasant with a pike. 3 months of drilling, maybe 6 if you wanted him really competent. Hand him a long, pointy stick, teach him to stand in formation, and suddenly he's killing knights who cost more than his entire village. The math stopped making sense, but here's what really twisted the knife. The Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died. Peasants who survived could suddenly demand wages. They could leave their lord's land and find better offers elsewhere. The entire economic system that supported knights, free labor, fixed rents, captive workers, collapsed. Kings noticed something else too. Feudal armies were unreliable. Knights showed up when they felt like it, fought for 40 days, then went home regardless of whether the war was finished. Professional soldiers who got paid, they stayed until the job was done. And they answered to the king, not some local lord with his own ambitions. Many knight families saw the writing on the wall. They quietly transitioned into country gentlemen, lawyers, politicians, merchants. They kept the fancy names and family crests, but dropped the swords. The romantic part? Humans couldn't let go of the mounted warrior fantasy. The last true cavalry charges happened in World War I. Machine guns versus horses. We held on to that dream for about 500 years past its expiration date. Some fantasies die hard.